Hello, welcome back for chapter 4 of The Wind in the Willows. Yesterday, Mole took himself off to the woods without his good friend Ratty and found himself in a bit of bother. Luckily for him, Rat spotted that he'd gone missing and followed his tracks and was able, luckily, to find him in the woods. They tried to make their way home through the snow and eventually found themselves turned around and lost in the depths of the wild wood. Moley fell and scraped his shin on what turned out to be the door scraper. After furious digging, they found out that door scraper came with the door, and when we left them, they had just knocked on that door and pulled on the doorbell to see who was inside. Chapter 4. Mr. Badger. They waited patiently for what seemed like a very long time, stamping their feet in the snow to keep warm. At last they heard the sound of a slow shuffling footstep approaching the door from the inside. It seemed, as Mole remarked to Rat, like someone walking in carpet slippers that were a little too large for him and down at the heel, which was intelligent of Mole because that's exactly what it was. There was the noise of a bolt shot back and the door opened a few inches, enough to show a long snout and a pair of sleepy, blinking eyes. "Now, the very next time this happens," said a gruff and suspicious voice, "I shall be exceedingly angry. Who is it at this time, disturbing people on such a night? Speak up!" "Oh, Badger," cried the Rat, "let us in, please. It's me, Rat, and my friend Mole. We've lost our way in the snow." "What, Ratty, my dear little man?" exclaimed the Badger in quite a different voice. "Come along in, both of you. Why, you must be perished. Well, I never lost in the snow, and in the wild wood too, at this time of night. But anyway, come in with you." The two animals tumbled over each other in their eagerness to get inside, and heard the door shut behind them with great joy and relief. The Badger, who wore a long dressing gown, and whose slippers were indeed very down at the heel, carried a flat candlestick in his paw, and had probably been on his way to bed when their summons had sounded. He looked kindly down on both of them and patted their heads. "This is not the sort of night for animals to be out," he said paternally. "I'm afraid you've been up to some of your pranks again, Ratty. But come along, come into the kitchen. There's a first-rate fire there and supper and everything." He shuffled out in front of them, carrying the light, and they followed him, nudging each other in an anticipating sort of way, down a long and gloomy, and to tell the truth, decidedly shabby passage, to a sort of central hall, out of which they could dimly see the other long tunnel-like passages branching, passages mysterious and without apparent end. But there were doors in the hall as well, stout, oaken, comfortable-looking doors. One of these Badger flung open, and at once they found themselves in the glow and the warmth of a fire-lit kitchen. The floor was well-worn red brick, and on the wide hearth burnt a fire of logs between two attractive chimney corners tucked away in the wall, well out of any suspicion of draught. A couple of high-backed settles facing each other on either side of the fire gave further sitting accommodations for the sociably disposed. In the middle of the room stood a long table of plain boards resting on trestles, with benches down each side. At one end of it, where an armchair stood pushed back, were a spread of the remains of Badger's plain but ample supper. Rows of spotless plates winked from the shelves of the dresser at the far end of the room, and from the rafters overhead hung hams, bundles of dried herbs, nets of onions, and baskets of eggs. It seemed a place where heroes could fitly feast after victory, where weary harvesters could line up in scores along the table and keep their harvest home with mirth and song, or where two or three friends could simply sit and talk about as they pleased, and eat and smoke and enjoy comfort and contentment. The ruddy brick floor smiled up at the smoky ceiling. The oaken settles, shiny with long wear, exchanged cheerful glances with each other. Plates on the dresser grinned at pots on the shelf, and the merry firelight flickered and played over everything without distinction. The kindly Badger thrust them down on the settle to toast themselves at the fire, and bade them remove their wet coats and boots. Then he fetched some dressing gowns and slippers, and himself bathed Mole's shin with warm water and mended the cut with a sticking plaster, till the whole thing was just as good as new, if not better. In the embracing light and warmth, warm and dry at last, with weary legs propped up in front of them and a suggestive clink of plates being arranged on the table behind them, it seemed to the storm-driven animals now safe in anchorage that the cold and trackless wildwood that they had just left outside was miles away, and all that they had suffered was as if in a half-forgotten dream. When at last they were thoroughly toasted, the badger summoned them to the table, where he had been busy laying a repast. They had felt pretty hungry before, but when they actually saw it, at last, the supper that he had spread out for them, really it seemed only a question of what they should attack first, when all was so attractive, and whether the other things would obligingly wait for them till they had time to give them attention. Conversation was impossible for a long time, and when it slowly resumed, it was the regrettable sort of conversation that results from talking with your mouth full. The badger did not mind that sort of thing at all, nor did he take any notice of elbows on the table or everybody speaking at once. As he did not go into society himself, he had not got an idea that these things belonged to things that didn't really matter. We know, of course, that he was wrong and took too narrow a view, because they do matter very much, though it would take too long to explain why. He sat in his armchair at the head of the table and nodded gravely at intervals as the animals told their story, and he did not look to be surprised or shocked at anything, and never said, "I told you so," or "just what I always said," or remarked that they ought to have done so and so, or ought not to have done something else. The mole began to feel very friendly towards him. When supper was really finished at last, and each animal felt that his skin was now tight as was decently safe, and that by this time he didn't care a hang for anybody or anything, they gathered round the glowing embers of the great wood fire and thought how jolly it was to be sitting up so late, and so independent, and so full. And after that they chatted for some time about things in general. The badger said heartily, "Now then, tell us the news from your part of the world. How's old Toad getting on?" "Oh, from bad to worse," said the rat gravely, whilst Mole, cocked up on a settle and basking in the firelight, his heels a little higher than his head, tried to look properly mournful. "Another smash-up only last week, and a bad one. You see, he will insist on driving himself, and he's hopelessly incapable. If only he'd employ a decent, steady, well-trained animal, pay him good wages, and leave everything to him, he'd get on all right. But no, he's convinced he's a heaven-born driver, and nobody can teach him anything, and all the rest follows." "How many has he had?" inquired the badger gloomily. "Smashes or machines?" asked the rat. "Oh, well, after all, it's the same thing with Toad. This is the 7th. As for the others, you know that coach house of his, it's piled up, literally piled to the roof with fragments of motor cars, none of them bigger than your hat. That accounts for the other 6, so far as they can be accounted for." "He's been in hospital 3 times, put in the mole, and as for the fines he's had to pay, it's simply awful to think of." "Yes, and that's part of the trouble," continued the rat. "Toad's rich, we all know, but he's no a millionaire, and he's a hopelessly bad driver, and quite regardless of law and order. Killed or ruined, it's got to be one of the 2 things sooner or later, Badger." "We're his friends. Oughtn't we to do something?" The badger went through a bit of hard thinking. "Now, look here," he said at last rather severely. "Of course, you know I can't do anything now." His 2 friends assented, quite understanding his point. No animal, according to the rules of animal etiquette, is ever expected to do anything strenuous or heroic or even moderately active during the off-season of winter. All are sleepy. Some are actually asleep. All are weather-bound, more or less, and All are resting from arduous days and nights, during which every muscle in them has been severely tested, and every energy kept at full stretch. "Very well, then," continued Badger, "but when once the year really has turned and the nights are shorter, and halfway through one rouses and feels fidgety and wanting to be up and doing by sunrise, if not before, you know." Both animals nodded gravely. They knew. "Well, then," went on Badger, "we, that is you and me and our friend the mole here, will take Toad seriously in hand. We'll stand no nonsense whatever. We'll bring him back to reason by force if need be. We'll make him be a sensible Toad." "Well, you're asleep, Rat." "Not me," said the Rat, waking up with a jerk. "He's been asleep 2 or 3 times since supper," said the Mole, laughing. He himself had been feeling quite wakeful and even lively, though he didn't know why. The reason was, of course, that he, being a naturally underground animal by birth and breeding, this situation of Badger's house exactly suited him and made him feel at home, while the Rat, who slept every night in a bedroom with which the windows opened on a breezy river, felt the atmosphere still and depressive. "Well, it's time we were all in bed," said the Badger, getting up and fetching flat candlesticks. "Come along, you two, and I'll show you to your quarters. And take your time tomorrow morning. Breakfast at any hour you please." He conducted the 2 animals to a long room that seemed half bedchamber and half loft. The Badger's winter stores, which indeed were visible everywhere, took up half the room. Piles of apples, turnips and potatoes, baskets full of nuts and jars of honey. But the 2 little white beds on the remainder of the floor looked soft and inviting. And the linen on them, though coarse, was clean and smelt beautifully of lavender. And the Mole and the Water Rat, shaking off their garments in some 30 seconds, tumbled in between the sheets with great joy and contentment. In accordance with the Badger's kindly injunctions, the 2 tired animals came to breakfast very late the next morning and found the fire burning bright in the kitchen and 2 young hedgehogs sitting on the bench at the table eating oatmeal porridge out of wooden bowls. The hedgehogs dropped their spoons, rose to their feet, and ducked their heads respectfully as the 2 entered. "There, set down," said the Rat pleasantly, "and go on with your porridge. Where have you 2 youngsters come from? Lost your way in the snow, I suppose?"
Yes, please, sir,"
said the elder of the 2 hedgehogs respectfully.
"Me and little Billy here, we were trying to find our way to school. Mother would have us go. Was the weather ever so... And of course we lost ourselves, sir, and Billy had got frightened and took and cried, being young and faint-hearted, and at last we happened up Mr. Badger's back door and made so bold as to knock. For Mr. Badger, he's a kind-hearted gentleman, as everyone knows."
"I understand," said the Rat, cutting himself some rashers from a side of bacon, while the Mole dropped some eggs into a saucepan. "And what's the weather like outside?" "You needn't sell me quite so much," he added.
"Oh, terrible bad, sir, terrible deep the snow is," said the hedgehog. "No getting out for the likes of you gentlemen today."
"Where's Mr. Badger?" inquired the Mole as he warmed the coffee pot beside the fire.
"The master's gone up to his study, sir," replied the hedgehog. "He has said as how he's going to be particularly busy this morning, and on no account was he to be disturbed."
This explanation, of course, was thoroughly understood by everyone present. The fact is, as already set forth, that when you have a life of intense activity for 6 months in the year, and comparative or actual somnolence for the other 6, during the latter period you cannot be continually pleading sleepiness when there are other people about or things to be done. The excuse gets monotonous. The animals well knew that Badger, having eaten a hearty breakfast, had retired to his study and settled himself in an armchair with his legs up and a red cotton handkerchief over his face, and was being busy in the usual way at this time of year. The front door bell clanged loudly, and the Rat, who was greasy with buttered toast, sent Billy, the smaller hedgehog, to see who it might be.
There was sound of much stamping in the hall, and presently Billy returned in front of the otter, who threw himself on Rat with an embrace of a shout and affectionate greeting. "Good off!" spluttered the Rat, his mouth full. "Thought I should find you here all right," said the otter cheerfully. "They were in a great state of alarm along the river bank when I arrived this morning. Rat never been home all night, nor Mole neither. Something dreadful must have happened. That's what they said. And the snow would cover up all your tracks, of course, but I knew that when people were in any fix, they mostly went to Badger. Or else Badger got to know of it somehow, so I came straight off here, through the wildwood and the snow. My, it was fine coming through the snow as the red sun was rising this morning, showing lovely against those black tree trunks. She went along in the stillness. Every now and again masses of snow slid off the branches with a sudden flop, making you jump and run for cover. Snow castles and snow caverns had sprung up out of nowhere in the night, and snow bridges, terraces and ramparts. I could have stayed and played with them for hours. Here and there their great branches had been torn away by the sheer weight of snow, and robins perched and hopped on them perkily in a sort of conceited way, just as if they'd done it themselves. A ragged string of wild geese passed overhead, higher in the grey sky, and a few rooks whirled over the trees, inspected and flapped off homewards with a disgusted expression. But I met no sensible being to ask the news of. About halfway across, I came on a rabbit sitting on a stump, cleaning his silly face with his paws. He was a pretty scared animal when I crept up behind him and placed a heavy forepaw on his shoulder. I had to cuff his head once or twice just to get any sense out of it at all. At last I managed to extract from him that Mole had been seen in the wild wood last night by one of them. It was the talk of the burrows, they said, how Mr. Mole, Rat's particular friend, was in a bad fix and how he'd lost his way, and they were up and out hunting and chivying him round and around. "Then why didn't any of you do something?" I asked. "You may have been blessed with brains, but there are hundreds of you, big stout fellows as fat as butter. You burrows run in all directions. You could have taken him in and made him safe and comfortable, or tried to at all events." "What, us?" he merely said. "Do something? Ask the rabbits." So I cuffed him again and I left him. There was nothing else to be done. At any rate, I'd learned something, and if I had any luck, I'd meet any of them. I could learn something more. That or they would. "Weren't you at all nervous?" asked the Mole, some of yesterday's terror coming back to him in the mention of the wildwood. "Nervous?" The otter showed a gleaming set of strong white teeth as he laughed. "I'd give them nerves if any of them tried anything on with me. Here, Mole, fry me some slices of ham. There's a good little chap you are. I'm frightfully hungry. And I haven't got any about to say to old Ratty here. I haven't seen him for an age." So the good-natured Mole, having cut up some slices of ham, set the hedgehogs to fries and returned to his own breakfast, while the otter and the Rat, their heads together, eagerly talked river shop, which is a long shop, and the talk about it is endless, running on like the babbling river itself. A plate of fried ham had just been cleared and sent back for more when Badger entered, yawning and rubbing his eyes, and greeted everyone in his quiet, simple way with kind inquiries for everybody. "It must be getting on for luncheon time," he remarked to Otter. "Better stop and have it with us. You might be hungry this cold morning." "Rather," replied the Otter, winking at Mole. "The sight of these greedy young hedgehogs stuffing themselves with fried ham makes me feel positively famished." The hedgehogs, who were just beginning to feel hungry again after their porridge and had been working so hard at their frying, looked timidly up at Mr. Badger, but were too shy to say anything. "Here, you two youngsters, be off home to your mother," said the Badger kindly. "I'll send someone with you to show you the way. You won't want any dinner today, I'll be bound." He gave them sixpence apiece and a pat on the head, and they went off with much respectful swinging of hats and touching of forelocks. Presently they all sat down to luncheon together, and Mole found himself placed next to Mr. Badger, and, as the other two were still deep in river gossip, from which nothing could divert them, took the opportunity to tell Badger how comfortable and home-like it all felt to him. "Once well underground," he said, "you know exactly where you are. Nothing can happen to you and nothing can get you. You're entirely your own master. You don't have to consult anybody or mind what they say. Things go on the same overhead and you let them, and you don't bother about them. When you want to, you go up and there are things just waiting for you." The badger simply beamed on him. "That's exactly what I say," he replied. "There's no security or peace or tranquillity except underground. And then, if you get ideas larger and want to expand, why, a dig and a scrape and there you are. If you feel your house is a bit too big, you stop up a hole or two, and there you go again. No builders, no tradesmen, no remarks passed on you by fellows looking over your wall, and above all, no weather. Look at Rat now, a couple of feet of floodwater and he's got to move into hired lodgings. Uncomfortable, inconveniently situated and horribly expensive. Take Toad. I say nothing against Toad Hall, quite the best house in these parts, as a house. But supposing a fire breaks out, where's Toad? Supposing the tiles are blown off, or the walls sink or crack, the windows get broken, where's Toad? Supposing the rooms are drafty, I hate a draft myself, where's Toad? No up and out of doors is good enough to roam about and get one's living in, but underground to come back to at last, that's my idea of home." The mole assented heartily, and Badger, in consequence, got very friendly with him. "When lunch is over," he said, "I'll take you round this little place of mine, and I can see you'll appreciate it. You understand what domestic architecture ought to be, you do." After luncheon, accordingly, and when the other two had settled themselves in a chimney corner and started a heated argument about the subject of eels, the Badger lit a lantern and bade them all follow him. Crossing the hall, they passed down one of the principal tunnels, and the wavering light of the lantern gave glimpses on either side of rooms both large and small, some mere cupboards, others nearly as broad and imposing as Toad's dining hall. Another passage at right angles led into another corridor, and here the same thing repeated. The mole was staggered at his size, the extent, the ramifications of it all. At length, the dim passages, the solid vaultings, crammed store chambers, and masonry everywhere. The pillars, the arches, the pavements. "How on earth, Badger," he said at last, "did you ever find time and strength to do all this? It's astonishing." "It would be astonishing indeed," said Badger simply, "if I had done it. But as a matter of fact, I did none of it. I only cleared out the passages and chambers as far as I had need of them. There's lots more of it all around about. I see you don't understand. I must explain it to you. Well, very long ago, on the spot where the wild wood waves now, before ever it planted itself or even grown up to what it is now, there was a city of people, you know. Here, where we're standing, they lived and walked and talked and slept and carried on their business. Here they stabled their horses and feasted. From here they rode out to fight or drove out to trade. They were powerful people, rich and great builders. They built to last, for they thought their city would last forever." "But what became of them?" asked Mole. "Who could tell?" said the Badger. "People come, they stay for a while, they flourish, they build, and they go. It's their way, but we remain. There are badgers here, I've been told, long before that city ever came to be, and now there are badgers here again. We're an enduring lot, and we may move out for a time, but we wait, we are patient, and we come back, and so it ever will be." "Well, and when they went at last, those people, then what?" said the Mole. "When they went," continued Badger, "the strong winds and persistent rains took the matter into hand, patiently, ceaselessly, year after year. Perhaps badgers too, in our own small way, helped, who knows? It was down, 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 gradually ruin and levelling and disappearance. There was all
Up, 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 gradually as seeds grew to saplings, and saplings to forest trees, and bramble and fern came creeping in to help. Leaf mould rose and obliterated. Streams in their winter freshets brought sand and soil to clog and cover. And in the course of time, our home was ready for us again, and we moved in. Up above us, on the surface, the same thing happened. Animals arrived, liked the look of the place, took up quarters, settled down, spread and flourished. They didn't bother themselves about the past, they never do. They're too busy. The place was a bit humpy and hillocky, naturally full of holes, but that was rather an advantage, and they didn't bother about the future either, the future when perhaps the people might move in again. For a time, as may very well be, the Wildwood is pretty well populated now, by the usual lot, good, bad and indifferent. I'll name no names. It takes all sorts to make a world, but I fancy you know something about them yourself by this time.
I do indeed, said the Mole with a slight shiver.
Well, well, said the Badger, patting him on the shoulder. It was your first experience of them, you see. They're not so bad, really, and we must all live and let live. But I'll pass the word around tomorrow, and I think you'll have no further trouble. Any friend of mine walks like he likes in this country, or I'll know the reason why. When they got back to the kitchen again, they found the Rat walking up and down, very restless. The underground atmosphere was oppressing him and getting on his nerves, and he seemed really to be afraid that the river might run away if he wasn't there to look after it. So he put his overcoat on and his pistols thrust into his belt again. "Come on, Mole," he said anxiously as he caught sight of them. "We must get off while it's daylight. Don't want to spend another night in the Wildwood again." "It'll be all right, my fine fellow," said the Otter. "I am coming along with you, and I know every path blindfold. And if there's a head that needs to be punched, you can confidently rely upon me to punch it." "You really needn't fret, Ratty," added the Badger placidly. "My passages run further than you think, and I've got bolt-holes on the edge of the wood in several directions, though I don't care for everyone to know about them. When you really have to go, you shall leave by one of my short cuts. Meantime, make yourself easy and sit down again." The Rat was nevertheless still anxious to be off and attend to his river. So the Badger, taking up his lantern again, led the way along a damp and airless tunnel that wound and dipped, part vaulted, part hewn through solid rock, for a weary distance that seemed to be miles. At last daylight began to show itself confusedly through a tangle of overgrowth hanging from the mouth of the passage, and the Badger, bidding them a hasty goodbye, pushed them hurriedly out of the opening, made everything look as natural as possible again, with creepers and brushwood and dead leaves, and retreated. They found themselves standing on the very edge of the wildwood, rocks and brambles and tree roots behind them, confusedly heaped and tangled. In front, a space of neat, quiet fields, hemmed by lines of hedges black on the snow, and far ahead, the glint of a familiar old river. While the wintry sun hung red and low on the horizon, the Otter, as knowing all the past, took charge of the party, and they trailed out in a beeline for the distant stile. Pausing there a moment and looking back, they saw the whole mass of the wildwood, dense and menacing, compact, grimly set in a vast white surrounding. Simultaneously they turned and made swiftly for home, for firelight and familiar things it played on, for the voice sounding cheerily outside their window of the river that they all knew and trusted in all of its moods, that never made them afraid with any amazement. As he hurried along, eagerly anticipating the moment when he would be home again, among the things he knew and liked, the Mole saw clearly that he was an animal of tilled field and hedgerow, linked to the ploughed furrow, the frequented pasture, the lane of evening lingerings, the cultivated garden plot. For others, the asperities, the stubborn endurance, or the clash of actual conflict was what went with nature in the rough, but he must be wise, must keep to the pleasant places in which lines were laid, and in which there held adventure enough in their own way to to last for a lifetime. There we go, chapter 4 done, and what a lovely homey chapter, finding out all about how Badger lives in his wonderful underground home in the forest. I don't know about you, but I'm certainly feeling a bit Badger-like at the moment, all tucked up in my little home, finding things to do of lazy afternoons. So, whilst you are there at home, why don't you do a little bit of what Badger clearly spent his time doing and research some of the history of where you live? I'm sure your house is probably sitting on top of the site of many interesting happenings in the past. Think about how you could use the internet or the people around you in the home and the books that you've got to research what went on underneath your feet before your house was there. If you find out anything really fascinating, you can stick a comment below, or you can comment to Mr. Key Storytime on Twitter, which is in the link at the description. And I will see you tomorrow for chapter 5, Dolce Domum.